All right, hello everyone. I decided not to be a disembodied voice for this preview video, the 1.5 preview video. So here we are, back in my yard. Let's briefly walk you through what's coming up in 1.5. You did a lot of heavy lifting for the last reading strategies that you will receive in this course in Module 1.4. You had all the ecological ways of reading, and there are a number of them. And I don't expect you to master all of them right away necessarily. But you can see that they're all interrelated and boil down to a few basic ecological principles. But big picture, we want to get beyond just looking at poetry as, is it fall, is it recovery, is it stewardship? And so there's a lot more to be said about the environment. One thing that came across in that lecture is that you can have environmental poetry or even poetry that's the appreciation of nature that doesn't provide critical commentary necessarily on the way humans are living. A lot of nature poetry can completely ignore humans, which isn't a problem, but is limited, right? And so we want to have as many reading strategies as possible to respond to everything that makes statements not just about the environment, but humans and the relationship to the environment as well. So all that said, here's what we're looking at. If you look at the screen for a minute, as always, you're going to watch the review video for the last unit. You can watch, you're watching this preview video. And we're just going to read one poem, Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Most people would see it as nature appreciation, but what I'd like you to do with this poem, and it comes with, of course, reading questions that you see here on the screen, I'd like you to go through and give it an ecological reading. So I had that video on the ecological ways of reading, my lecture on ecological ways of reading in the last unit. I'd like you to apply all of those specifically now to Wordsworth's poem and see what happens if we start to look through these things. Does Wordsworth have any of these ecological or sustainability principles embedded in his poem? It's an older poem before the world was having a lot of problems, right? So we might just say, well, Wordsworth was known as a romantic poet, meaning that he was looking for the spirit or vitality of nature in some sort of religious impulse. He was known as a deist, which means that God is out there somewhere. You believe in a higher power, but you just don't necessarily see it in an organized religion. And this is how we would term Wordsworth typically. So what I want you to do is just go in and give it an ecological reading. And are any of these things going on? Is there any commentary on sustainability? Any of these issues right here? A big question is, how is Wordsworth using nature, so to speak, as a poet, right? We can read it this way too. Clearly he loves nature and has a relationship with it, but is there any commentary on human uses of nature? That's what I want you to do. Now when you're done with that, here's the fun of this module. You will then move on to watch a video that I didn't do, but it is a really great 10-minute video on two different ecological readings of Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, with two very different outcomes, which I thought you would find interesting to see. Here's one way we could read the poem, and it's very different than that next interpretation. And they're both eco-critical in their own way, but we arrive at two very different interpretations. So after you do your own thinking on it, you might want to write it up, write down some ideas. You can watch the video and see which interpretation from the video you lean toward, but also see what you can pick up from each interpretation of the video, each interpretation of the video, to add to your own interpretation that you initially gave of Wordsworth. The last thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be reading. It is currently sideways on your screen, but you'll be reading Big Two-Hearted River by Ernest Hemingway, a short story. And so what's to be said about this? So the main character is Nick Adams. He's a character from a bunch of stories called the Nick Adams stories from Hemingway. So Nick is a World War I veteran. This is a story written in, I would imagine, the 1920s. Right around there. I don't know the specific year off the top of my head. But Hemingway himself, the author of this, was an ambulance driver in World War I. He was also he's known to be a manly man, if you know anything about Hemingway. He was a big game hunter, hunted elephants and tigers in Africa, and a lot of his stories take place in Africa about people who are hunting there. This story, however, Big Two-Hearted River, is about Nick, this World War I veteran, who is shell-shocked, what we would in the modern day call PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, something a lot of veterans have when they come back from war. Well, of course, we didn't know what it was after World War I, but that's what it was. They were just called shell-shocked. And so Nick is suffering from PTSD, we would say today. and he's going to the river to go fishing. He's searching for something. He wants to heal in some way. Your big question is, why is it called Big Two-Hearted River? What are the two hearts of the river? This is what you want to read this for. To help you get there, of course, I want you to take everything that we used so far, fall, recovery, etc., but also our ecological principles, and see how these might apply to this story. Now remember, from the Wordsworth video that you'll watch, you're getting two very different views of how Wordsworth is using nature. I'd like you to take those basic ideas and apply them to Nick and Big Two-Hearted River as well. So the two different methods of interpreting Wordsworth's poem, go ahead and apply them here. And you'll get two very different readings of Big Two-Hearted River as well. And so you'll feel how your method of interpretation and the values that you use to look at a text give you a radically different way of reading it and a radically different conclusion as well. And so that's what we are shooting for today. The other thing that's worth saying about Big Two-Hearted River, I sort of jokingly put it as the start of our adventure stories, because in 1-6 you'll be reading 2 adventure stories to end Module 1 here before we take our midterm exam. But Big Two-Hearted River, although it's a fishing story and it's in a river, is a little bit slow-paced. And here's why. You might be reading it and thinking, wow, this is really bad writing. Nothing happens. There's not much action here. Where's all the action? This is a fishing story, a nature story, right? Sort of pseudo-adventure story. But remember that Nick is shell-shocked, suffering from PTSD, and is feeling a little lost, is cognitively struggling just to make it in the world now that he's back in the world. He's revisiting a countryside that he knows from his childhood. You'll find out that he's been there before. And so what you get in the style of Hemingway in this short story is it's Hemingway, the author, experimenting with how someone with PTSD, shell-shock, would see the world and experience the world. So if this story seems slow at times, and if it seems like Nick is struggling to understand, that's on purpose, right? That was Hemingway's experiment. He wanted to take us deep into the mind of a character and show us that character's struggle. Stories usually have lots of action and conflict and rising action and character development. And this is an experimentation, and then in some ways it is the opposite of those things. It is in some ways, I'm not going to say it's an anticlimactic story. It certainly has a climax and builds. But you'll notice that it's an action-packed, right? You might not call it a page-turner, but I want us to still look through here, and I want you to appreciate what Hemingway is trying to do in this story, show us the mental landscape of someone with PTSD, and how they would see the environment and how they might use the environment. Along the way, I'll tell you that you've got some required questions for the reading, and I gave you, because it is sort of a longer piece and sort of an experimental piece, even though it's not hard to read, it's easy enough to read. The experimentation is in the pacing and what Nick is struggling with. So I gave you just a slew of questions in your reading packet. You don't have to answer most of them. You can kind of combine all these into your larger answers. But to make sure that you had support for reading this story and its sort of experimental nature, I wanted to make sure that you had enough questions to kind of guide you through at key moments. So these are, of course, sort of chronological questions that will take you through certain moments in the story. And so that'll help you if you're feeling a bit lost in the story. So just go ahead and use those questions. All right, and otherwise, enjoy these readings. As I said, they're the beginning of our adventure portion. In 1-6, we'll have more adventure stories. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you all.